going. There's two dates, I'm sure you all know, but I'm just going to ask you. Ian will know them, so he can only come in last.
Am I going to win a bottle of wine?
When was the Battle of Trafalgar, other than Ian?
1805.
Yeah, but what on the month and the date?
10:30 on July.
You know, really, I'm sure I've done this talk before.
October.
Ian, tell them the date.
No.
October
Yeah, October, what?
21st.
21st, well done. That's 1 point to you.
Oh,
And-
1 point.
And when was the Battle of Waterloo? Now, I know he definitely knows this. Battle of Waterloo was
18th of June, 1815.
excellent.
Oh.
That's a right.
That's not when it started.
Now, we're going back to 1805, the 21st of October. My hero Nelson has beaten the French and the Spanish, and we now rule the waves. We had the biggest navy then, and it will not be beaten till the First World War, 100 years later. So we were master of the seas, but Napoleon was master of the land. And like Hitler, he controlled the whole of Europe, apart from Great Britain. And that included, there were 4 big empires, you might say, in 1805. Great Britain, Austria, Prussia and Russia. And Napoleon had beaten everybody but Great Britain.
Only in 1805.
Now he makes a fatal error, as Napoleon. He decides he's going to put in a continental system. Richard, what was a continental system?
Where you kept croissants and that sort of thing.
You or that.
Go on, Ian, what was a continental system?
Well, he was trying to blockade trade with Britain.
Very good. Earlier mark there. Now, in a way, that was a big mistake because Portugal wanted to trade with Great Britain, and Napoleon was so upset at this continuation, he decided he would in fact invade Portugal. And what he did first, he removed the King of Spain and put his brother Joseph on the throne. Now that was a big mistake, because all of a sudden he's alienated Spain, who used to be, in the Battle of Trafalgar, Spain was an ally of France. So we have a situation where Spain and Portugal are not happy, and Portugal still wants to trade. So Napoleon says in 1808, right, we're going to invade Portugal, and with 300,000. Now, one of the strengths, our population in 1801, the first census, what would it be, Rob? Our population.
About 1 million.
How many? Million? Okay, good.
510.
They were 10.5 million. Now, what would France's population be, Ken?
China down.
Up,
20.
Down.
up,
What, 15?
up,
20 million.
up.
30?
Yes, 29 million. So you can see the strength of France with all those people. So Napoleon put 300,000 into Spain, and he then moved into Portugal. At the same time that Sir John Moore, great leader, a great man, took 30,000 troops and took them into Portugal. And Napoleon, the only time that Napoleon went into Spain, they call it the Peninsular War. The Peninsular War being Portugal and Spain. The only time he went in, he crushed the English, and in fact we had to do a Dunkirk. we had to retreat. The Royal Navy had to get us out of Corunna. So as far as Napoleon was concerned, that probably might be the end of Great Britain, because he knew we did not have a big army, nothing like they had. However, they decide, the British, to appoint Wellington. Now, Richard, what was his name? It
He's
wasn't
my hero.
What was it?
My hero, Wellington.
Yeah, but what was his name before he came Wellington? George of Wellington.
Oh, gosh, I should know.
Wellington.
Ian, tell me.
That was like, he was Irish, wasn't he?
Duke of.
Arthur Wellesley, born in Dublin,
Yeah.
from an aristocratic family, and he had done wonders in India. And he came back when he thought he'd had enough anyhow. So they appointed him in 1809 to lead troops again into Portugal. Now, one of these strengths that Wellington had, never lost a battle in Wellington. 34 battles, never lost one.
Then.
Wellington was more defensive than attacking. He had the welfare always of his soldiers. So he knew that he could never beat the strength of the Spanish. What he decided to do is build fortifications around Lisbon, because he knew if they were going to get beat, he wanted the Royal Navy to be able to take them from Lisbon. Now, it took 9 months to build these fortifications. Really, the French weren't really aware. They took 10 months to build them, 3 lines, total of 21 miles of fortification, just like the Romans did, as you might say, when they built Hadrian's Wall. And when Napoleon heard that Wellington, because he'd heard of Wellington through all Wellington's successes in India, he said to Messina, marshals, what Napoleon appointed was always marshals, marshals this, marshals that. And he said to Marshal Messina, right, go and beat the British. They're in Portugal. When Messina got there with 70,000 troops, he suddenly was faced with his fortifications. And they destroyed all the fields around, so they could not sort of do anything from the land. He stayed there 3 months in Messina, and then they went back, because they didn't have the lines of food and communications. So this is the start now of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, to start chipping away. He knew he never could really beat Spain because of its, well, the French in Spain, but he did it sort of battle by battle. Talavera was his first big one, and he's moving through Spain now. Now, of course, he had not only help from the Portuguese, you know, they joined with Wellington, and the Spanish. And we now come to 1812. Now, what great event happened in 1812 in Europe? Big event. Tell them.
When he tried to take on Russia.
Yes. Now then, why Michael Hindle? Why?
Oh, stop lying, stop lying.
Now then, Michael Hindle.
I blame you, Michael Jackson.
Now, this is a double, 2 marks for this event, right? Why did Napoleon in 1812 decide he was going to invade Russia?
Well, he wanted to make France a bigger.
You what?
He wanted to take over the world. He wanted to take over Russia and everywhere
Well,
else.
he'd already beaten Russia when Russia had sent in troops earlier, you know. But of course, to take on a vast continent like Russia, he took 500,000 men, did Napoleon, to Russia. and they actually got into Moscow, but of
Yeah.
course what the Muscovites had done, Alexander the First, Tsar Alexander the First, had told all the inhabitants of Moscow, move back 20 miles. So when Napoleon's army get there, there's nothing to eat, there's nothing at all. They stopped there 3 weeks and then decided they better come back. But what was the reason, Richard? That Napoleon was prepared to go to Russia. A huge mistake.
It must
Stop
have been a
trading
woman.
Britain.
If you what?
Stop trading with Britain.
Good last, well done. That's a double mark. That
Stop
was.
trading with Britain.
What was happening is Russia wanted to send grain. Now, by the
Yeah.
way, where would all the grain come from?
You don't get a point for
We
that.
wanted the grain, and Russia wanted to, and they would not stop, so Napoleon said, right, we're going to stop you by invading you. That was a huge mistake.
Yeah.
So we're in 1812. Wellington is now moving through Spain, and one of his two biggest battles was the Battle of Salamanca, which is near Madrid. I mean, some of these, casualties that occurred in those battles, it was frightening, really.
What's interesting, Michael, sorry to interrupt, is that he went with 500,000 to Moscow. And
They
when
did,
he
it came back with 100,000.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, did I not say that?
No.
Oh, sorry.
And there's
Well, that's a more.
there's a wonderful graph drawn at the time by a general,
Yeah,
which shows the 500,000 men depleting as they get back to mainland Europe or Central Europe. And it was
why
every
did,
time they crossed the river. 'cause it
why
was-
did Hitler not take
Well-
that into account?
Exactly.
Because that was his
It's
undoing, wasn't it?
repeating itself, yeah.
Always think of history. History was the future.
Well, wasn't it the Russian winter, Michael?
So now then, pardon?
It was a Russian winter, really, wasn't
Oh
it?
yeah,
As well,
yeah.
yeah.
And
Well,
also the teas during.
they only stopped 3 weeks because they realised winter was coming, and that did it for them. What a disaster. So now it's 1812. France has lost 400,000 troops, and out of the 300,000 in Spain, that's dwindling. Now, because things were changing fast, it allowed Prussia and Austria to come back into the war again. And the next battle was 1813, as far as Wellington was gone, the Battle of Vittoria. That's sort of in the Basque Country, top of Spain. They won that one, huge battle. So now he's crossing the Pyrenees and gone into France. So it's now 1814. And he's moving to Paris as the Prussians and the Austrians are moving also to Paris. And that was the end of Napoleon. April 1814. So Ron, where was Napoleon sent? He had to abdicate. No, it's all right. You come in second. Where was he sent to, Napoleon?
Where did he finish up his in Toledo?
Where?
Saint Helena.
No.
No, Elba.
Elba.
Franco's sorry about that. Franco's place. So
In Aussie.
so is Wellington.
Yeah.
He's with 1,000 troops he's allowed to have. He's sent over to Elba, thinking that the Italians would do a fairly decent job. But he was more or less made mayor. Now, Napoleon was a great reformer. He was a brilliant man, was Napoleon, apart from making these mistakes. I mean, he put in a great sewer system. He created the first bank in France. He had reforms on education. Really, in fact, some of the reforms are still in France to this day.
I can tell you how he died, you know.
Who?
I can tell you how he died, you know.
Well, lots of
He
that.
did die in Elba.
No, I'll tell you why. Well, he didn't, well, fair enough.
Anyhow, he's more or less mayor of Elba, and he enjoyed himself in a way. the French had put the king back on the throne. Who was the king that went back on the throne? This is for 3 points.
It's gonna be a Louis.
Louis.
It's gonna be a Louis.
Aye.
14.
Louis the what?
Second
I'm
15.
going 14.
50.
Who?
14.
No, Louis the 18th.
18.
Louis the 17th is the one who had his head chopped off. So he had no more better sense than thinking again he could rule just like Charles I, the adult divinity. And the people got fed up in 10 months only. They were getting upset with Louis, and Napoleon knew that things were not good in France. So he made the decision, with 950 of his troops, he sailed from Elba, this is in 1815, and landed on the south of France. Now, Louis the 17th knew what was happening. Of course, you know, they must have had mobiles in those days to know what was going on. Things moved fast in those days.
Is it 17th or 18th?
So he said to his main marshal, who was
So,
Napoleon's right-hand man, right, you go down with troops, arrest Napoleon. And Marshal Ney said, yes, sir, I will bring him back in an iron cage. So Ney goes down to Marseille, where Napoleon's landed. And by the time he's got down, Marshal Ney realizes the charismatic Napoleon has swung people round almost at once. So Marshal Ney changes completely and accepts that what Napoleon is doing is right. And Napoleon coming up to Paris, and by the time he reaches Paris, has got up to 100,000 who were supporting him. I mean, how could a man who's seen 400,000 deaths in the Moscow shambles and up to 200,000 lost in the Peninsular War support Napoleon with those heavy losses? That tells you, you know, what sort of a man Napoleon was.
They didn't have TikTok though.
Pardon?
They didn't have TikTok in those days.
No. So we are now aware, this country, so is Russia, so is Austria, so is Prussia, that things are happening because no one thought for one moment that Napoleon would be able to do what he was going to do. So they realized that Napoleon knew if he could beat England or Britain on their own, we'd win, which he would have done. But Russia was the nearest big empire to be able to move its troops. Austria was too far away, so was Prussia. So Nelson's troops are based near Brussels, and the Prussians tried to join up, but Napoleon moved fast. And on the 16th of June, there was a ball. The Duchess of Richmond had a ball. Is that right, Ian?
yeah, in Brussels.
And all the officers attended, including Wellington. And at 11 o'clock, when they were due to eat supper, a messenger came in to say that the French were in the vicinity. And as Wellington said, by Jove, they've humbugged me again. No one thought they could have moved that fast to get to where the British army was. with the Prussian army 10 miles to the east. So of course, things happened fast. Napoleon knew he had to get the Brits, just the Brits before the Prussians would come. And we've now come to the day after the ball, the 16th of June, that's 2 days before the big battle. And the British was at Quatre Bras, which is about 3 miles from the Battle of Wellington, the Battle of Waterloo. And Napoleon is facing the Prussians at Ligny. Now Napoleon beats the Prussians, and the Prussians had to retreat. So although they were beaten, they still had a sizable army left. Wellington is facing Marshal Ney at Quatre Bras and win. So we now have what a situation where we've won, the Prussians have lost, the French are there and thereabouts. Prussia were a bit upset. Who was the leader this side of Prussia? Who was the great man, 71 year older? Who? Never heard you say a word. Blucher. Blucher. 71. Realised he knew that he had to support the British. He thought the world of Wellington, and although Blucher's officers said the Brits should have come over to help us, Blucher said no, we will support. Now Wellington knew that he could not beat the French on their own, because what had happened at the Waterloo 2 days later, we have 80,000 troops. Napoleon's got 100,000, but our 80,000 consisted of 50% non-British, because a year had elapsed. A lot of our soldiers either retired, didn't want to come back so fast. So our 40,000 of our troops were Belgium, Dutch, because Napoleon had also put on the Dutch throne his younger brother Louis. Germans, Germany wasn't Germany in those days, Portuguese. So Wellington had all these languages to contend with, whereas Napoleon, with his battle-hour troops, all could speak French, and they had more guns. So we've now come to the 18th of June, the Battle of Waterloo. And the battle was done, 2 miles consisted the Battle of Waterloo, of which 40,000 casualties were had by Napoleon's, and we lost 20,000. But we were on the defensive. What Wellington had done between the 16th, when he had beaten the French under Ney, he had got the ground that he knew he needed. He always worked on reverse slopes. He wanted a ridge so that his soldiers could be behind it and that it's uphill. Now, of course, Napoleon knew he couldn't bugger around. He knew he was only facing the British at the start of the 18th of June. Now, unfortunately for Napoleon, it had rained very, very heavily the day before, which hampered, by the way, the Prussian army getting to Waterloo, but it also stopped Napoleon using he had 300 and odd guns. Can you imagine 300 odd guns blasting away? But the ground was too wet. The cannonballs, wouldn't have ricocheted like they would do on dry ground. So he waited, instead of starting at 8 o'clock in the morning, he waited till lunchtime. And of course, that 4 hours were pretty crucial because Blucher had retreated from Ligny to Wavre. So they're 10 miles away from helping Wellington. So we had to contend with moving 10 miles with all his guns. With all the rain that had fallen, it hampered him. So the battle has started and the Prussians aren't in sight. And of course, there's no doubt they would have won that day without the Prussians, you know. No doubt. In fact, he would not have gone into war against the French, would Wellington, if he knew that the Prussians weren't on their way. So, as the battle's going on, ferocious, it only lasted 9 hours, started at 12 o'clock on the 18th, finished at 9 o'clock. Round about 4 o'clock, Marshal Ney, his right-hand marshal, in charge of the cavalry, they had 8,000 cavalry, did Ney under his command. In fact, that day, 35,000 horses were killed in that 9 hours. You can just imagine the carnage that was happening in this 2.5 square miles of battle. Marshal Ney notices that the English, there's quite a lot, retreating over the ridge. Ney, without any instructions from Napoleon, made a decision. He would attack the middle, was the middle where Napoleon had told Ney, be ready, the British are not strong. They're all right on the flanks, but down the centre, Ney could see what he thought was the centre retreating, and they weren't. It was just injured soldiers who were going over the ridge to be tended to. So without any infantry or gun support, no artillery, no infantry, Marshal Ney decided he would charge. Now, one thing Wellington instilled that if that happened, they had to go in what they call military squares. 20 yards either front, 20 yards, 18 yards down the side, filled with 500 people, or with soldiers, with their bayonets, and those at the front had to sort of kneel down, and then you have the next one kneeling higher, and the last two. And of course, the ones lower down had their bayonets fixed. So when the horses arrived, no artillery, no infantry, a terrible decision of Marshal Ney. The horses either panicked because they did not like seeing bayonets all at them. Marshal Ney, with his 7,000 troops, made 7 charges, and they didn't dislodge. They had about 6 squares, did the British, and they were unable to penetrate. So he's lost now his cavalry, the thing that you need most of all if you're going to win a war. So now there is this disadvantage, but nevertheless we still needed Prussia to arrive. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon the Prussians arrived. What had happened is Napoleon had said to Marshal Grouchy, right, you've 30,000 men of my 100,000, you've got to stop the Prussians approaching. He failed, Grouchy. Instead of stopping the Prussians, he only stopped about 10% of them. The rest went round him, which meant, of course, that they got through. And at about 6 o'clock, they arrived. And at that time, the battle changed. All of a sudden, with the strength of the Prussians, with the depletion of the French, Napoleon had to use the last thing in his army, who never ever been beaten, his Imperial Guard. Hand-picked men who rarely ever went into fight because they'd usually, Napoleon had won the battles in the preceding years, sent in the Imperial Guard, but unfortunately the casualties were so high, all of a sudden they retreated. And when the French soldiers could see the Imperial Guard retreat, that was the end, as you might say. That was 9 o'clock at night. And in fact, between, well, the Prussians mainly, chased the French. A lot of, as I say, they had 40,000 casualties. We had 20,000.
The reason the Prussians were allowed to finish them off was because of the biggest battle of all, which was Austerlitz in 1805.
Oh yeah,
Immediately at the same time as Trafalgar.
yes, that was.
So they had a score to settle.
They did.
So Wellington left it to them to
Blucher
finish them off.
always wanted
Yeah.
revenge for being beaten at that big battle,
Yeah.
Austerlitz. So we've now got Napoleon fleeing the battlefield, and he got back to Paris totally defeated. Was of course his army. He tried to get on a vessel to go to America, but unfortunately he was spotted, and he was then put on the Northumberland, SS Northumberland, which took 5 weeks to take him to St. Helena. Helena is the nearest land from St. Helena, is 2,000 miles to South America, you know, very South America, 1,000 miles, sorry, 2,000 to South America, 1,000 to South Africa. That's how remote it was. So of course he arrived there in late 1815, and he dies in 1821. The cause of death is that some say it was due to cancer from the wallpaper, because they used to put tungsten into the manufacture of wallpaper. Whether that was true, I don't really know. But the French asked could he be brought back to Paris. I don't think we agreed for a certain amount of time. But in 1840 we agreed that he could be sent back to France, where he can be seen on view anywhere. Where is he in France? You know,
He's in Paris, indeed. He's in Paris, and he's two.
Is it Amberley? How do you pronounce in French Amberleys?
Well,
Yeah, that's where he is. Our hero Wellington, he was made a duke. He was made Duke of Wellington in 1814. When he was made the duke, of course, in 1814, Sir Alexander I had said to him, "You've saved the world once, you've got to save it again," which he did, of course. So he comes back. I mean, it's hard to say what it was like in this country. Napoleon had ruled since not ruled, but he from 1993 was the Napoleon era, when the invasion of this country was always there and thereabouts. So you can imagine the relief, and Wellington was seen as a conquering hero. He was made Prime Minister in 1828 for 2 years, but the trouble with poor old Wellington was that he had the Irish to contend with. in 1828, if you were an Irish MP, you weren't allowed to sit in the Houses of Parliament. And he agreed with the Houses of Parliament that should remain. You know, I mean, we have buggers. The Irish has never been an easy problem, has it? And because he supported it, he had a lot of flack thrown from him from Ireland. And then his second term was in 1832 to 1834, when he changed tact. He then said, yes, there should be reform in Ireland, and Catholics MPs should be allowed to sit in Parliament. So he then had trouble from more people who were throwing things. He lived in Apsley House, and he had to put iron shutters up, and that's why he was called the Iron Duke, because of all the people who were whizzing stuff at the Apsley House. And I think we all agree we owe a lot to Wellington, a great man. Thank you very much.